Liam, Chloe, and Noah were good friends. They often sought adventure together. One crisp autumn afternoon, a letter arrived. It was an invitation. The envelope was old, without a stamp. The card inside was thick. It invited them to a midnight party. The party was at Blackwood Manor. They had never heard of this place. The invitation was not signed. It was a most peculiar summons. They felt a mix of excitement and a touch of unease. Why were they invited? Who could have sent such a strange note? Chloe examined the elegant looping script. It seemed to be written by a very old hand. The ink was a faded sepia brown. Noah wondered if it was some kind of prank. But Liam felt a pull, a sense of mystery. He declared they simply had to go. The unknown called to them. Their journey began as dusk settled. The drive to Blackwood Manor was long. It took them far from the familiar city lights. They travelled deeper into the quiet countryside. The roads became narrow and winding. Tall, dark trees lined the way. Their branches seemed to reach out like skeletal arms. A light fog began to gather. It swirled around the car, making the world outside indistinct and eerie. They felt a growing anticipation. At last, through the mist, they saw it. Blackwood Manor stood upon a lonely hill. It was a vast, imposing structure. Dark stone walls rose against the night sky. Only a few windows showed a dim, flickering light. The rest were dark, like vacant eyes. The house looked as if it had been forgotten by time. A chill wind whistled around the eaves. They parked the car and slowly approached the great front door. The heavy oak door creaked open slowly. It seemed to open on its own accord. No butler or servant greeted them. They stepped into a cavernous entrance hall. It was grand, with a high vaulted ceiling, but dust lay thick on every surface. Cobwebs hung like ancient tattered lace. The air was still and very cold. A faint musty odour filled their nostrils. It was the smell of decay and disuse. Other guests were already present. They moved with a strange, slow grace. Their attire was most unusual. The men wore frock coats and high collars. The ladies were in long flowing gowns, fashions from a bygone era. They did not speak to one another, or if they did, their voices were mere whispers, too soft to be understood. They drifted through the hall like phantoms. Some turned their heads slowly to observe the newcomers. A faint melody drifted through the air. It was a sad, melancholic waltz. The music seemed to come from everywhere, and yet from nowhere in particular. There was no visible orchestra, no musicians. The notes hung in the air, adding to the chill. The friends looked for a host, someone in charge, but no one stepped forward to welcome them. No refreshments were offered. The silence was heavy, broken only by the mournful tune. An unsettling atmosphere pervaded the manor. It was not a joyful party. It felt more like a solemn, silent vigil. Liam, Chloe, and Noah stood close together. They felt like intruders in a private sorrow. The other guests barely acknowledged their presence. Their eyes seemed to look through them. The friends began to feel a distinct sense of being watched, not just by the silent figures, but by the house itself. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the hall. It made the ancient tapestries on the walls sway. Yet all the windows were securely closed. The tall candles in their ornate holders flickered wildly. Their flames danced as if in a strong wind. Shadows leaped and writhed on the walls. They twisted into grotesque, fleeting shapes. The dim light made everything seem uncertain. The friends exchanged nervous glances. This was no ordinary draught. Chloe felt a light touch on her shoulder. It was cold, like a breath of icy air. She spun around quickly, her heart pounding. There was no one behind her, just empty space and deepening shadows. She reached up to touch the spot. A shiver ran down her spine. "Did you see anyone?" she whispered to Liam. He shook his head, his eyes wide. The feeling of being watched intensified. It was as if unseen eyes followed their every move. Liam found himself staring at a large, gilded mirror. It hung on a far wall, dark with age. For a fleeting moment he saw a face. It was not his own reflection. It was pale with sorrowful eyes. Then, it was gone, as quickly as it appeared. He blinked, wondering if his mind was playing tricks. He told himself it was just the poor light, or a smudge on the old glass. But a seed of genuine fear began to sprout within him. Noah, meanwhile, began to hear things. Faint whispers seemed to emanate from the very walls. They were too quiet to make out words, but they sounded like hushed, urgent conversations. He pressed his ear against the cold stone. The whispering seemed to grow louder, then fade. He could almost discern names he did not know. He pulled away, a cold sweat on his brow. The fear was no longer a vague unease. It was palpable. The friends huddled together, their initial curiosity gone. It was replaced by a growing dread. "I think we should leave," Noah whispered. His voice trembled slightly. Chloe and Liam nodded in agreement. This party was beyond strange. It was deeply unsettling, even terrifying. They decided to make their way back to the great oak door. They moved quietly, trying not to draw attention. The silent guests continued their slow, ghostly movements, seemingly unaware. As they neared the exit, the faint mournful music stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was deafening. Every single one of the other guests froze in place. Then, as one, they turned their heads. They all looked directly at Liam, Chloe, and Noah. Their faces were pale and indistinct in the gloom. Their eyes, however, seemed to gleam with a dark, knowing light. The friends stopped, rooted to the spot by those collective stares. A voice echoed through the vast hall. It was not human, not quite. It was deep, resonant, and seemed to come from the air itself. "The observation period has concluded," the voice intoned. "Your emotional responses have been duly noted. You may now depart our little theatre." As the voice faded, the strange, old-fashioned guests began to shimmer. Their forms became translucent. Then, slowly, they faded away into nothingness, like smoke. Liam, Chloe, and Noah stood in stunned silence. The hall was now completely empty, save for themselves. The host was not a person. The guests were not ghosts of the past. Blackwood Manor was a stage. And they, the three friends, had been the unwitting exhibits. The party was a carefully constructed illusion, designed to elicit fear, curiosity, and wonder, for the amusement of unseen, perhaps unknowable entities. They had been the midnight entertainment,